In this session, we want to talk about intercultural communication because we deal with different cultures all the time, right? And it's not necessarily people from other countries, but in fact, every person that we encounter is from another culture. So the principles apply every day, even when we're not going out of our own home country. So a question we might start with is, what is culture? What is culture? It's one of those words we use all the time. It's good to sort of break it apart before we start seeing how we can address it in our communication. Culture could be described as these things: knowledge, attitudes, values, experiences, behaviors, meanings, and beliefs. Because we all have a different history, right? Each one of us comes from a family that's different. Each one of us has had different life experiences. And so every interpersonal encounter we have, every communication encounter we have, goes back to those things. So it's like, what do you believe and what really motivates you? And we realize that when we get into situations where we're dealing with cultural differences, our agendas can be different because of what we believe and what is in the background. These are some other definitions of culture. The totality of a group's values, history, experiences, patterns of behavior, concepts, and assumptions about life. We all live by rules that are sort of unwritten. You know, this is important, but this isn't. This is how you should act in this particular situation. This is inappropriate. We all grow up with those things, but the problem is we all have different perspectives on what those things are. Another definition: symbols, rituals, values, laws, taboos. That's interesting, huh? Religions and heroes. Culture is how we call these unwritten rules about how to be a good member of a group. Basically, culture is everything that we believe and everything that we value, and we're almost ignorant of what it is because it's so natural. The way we were raised, we think it was natural. Another definition by Edward T. Hall, who's a really famous anthropologist and has contributed a lot to communication theory. He said, culture is man's medium. There's not one aspect of human life that is not touched and altered by culture. It's really profound, isn't it? This means personality, how people express themselves, including shows of emotion, because communication is not just what we say, right? It's lots of other things. It's how we emote. It's what we do with our body and all kinds of things. The way they think, how they move, how problems are solved, how their cities are planned. Isn't that interesting? Because the way you plan a city or a community reflects your worldview, right? How transportation systems function and are organized, as well as economic and governmental systems, how they're put together and they function. We're talking about worldview, which is the fancy way to say that's philosophy, right? So you want to impress anybody, you just start talking about philosophy and they're like, oh, they must be really smart. But really, philosophy is just worldview. It's how people view the world, right? And each one of us has a philosophy. I really like this quote by Hofstede, and I'm gonna quote this guy. He's a communication scholar who's contributed a lot to helping us understand culture and how we communicate within cultures. He says, it is sometimes amazing how different people in other cultures behave. We tend to have a human instinct that deep inside we're all the same, but we're not. Therefore, if we go into another country and make decisions based on how we operate in our own home country, the chances are we'll make some really bad decisions. Again, we think that everybody sees the world like we do, but it's not true. We're all socialized, okay? So this is what we mean. We grow up believing certain things. We're socialized into our culture. We tend to view our own culture as reality, the way things are. So it's challenging for us to identify and articulate aspects of our own culture. We recognize differences in other people, but we sometimes we find it really, really hard to describe our own culture. And it's really interesting when you have cross-cultural experiences and you start to analyze other cultures. It's actually good to go back and reflect on your own. What do I really believe? How do I really communicate? What things do I think are really important? And how might that differ from other groups? We tend to judge other cultures by what we think is normal. There are many ways to try to understand culture. We have different theories and different models, different ways that we can look at cultural patterns. And one that I find really helpful is to look at values, beliefs, norms, and social practices. So values refer to what a group of people define as good and bad, or what it regards as important. Okay? So what does a culture value? Beliefs refer to the basic understanding of a group of people about what the world is like, or what is true or false. So what does a culture believe about life? Norms refers to rules for appropriate behavior, which provide the expectations people have of one another and of themselves. And social practices are the predictable behavior patterns that members of a culture typically follow. So let's unpack these. Beliefs are ideas that people assume to be true about the world. In the United States, there is a deep belief that you can become successful if you work hard enough. So all you have to do is pull up your bootstraps and you can make it. Anyone can be president. Learned interpretations cultural members use to decide what is correct, how a group makes sense of the world, and includes assumptions about life. Values have to do with what a culture thinks are important. What are the desired characteristics of the culture? And these serve as a guiding principle. So norms have to do with what is appropriate behavior, okay? So a norm possibly in your family was that you would go to college or that you went to church every Sunday. Those are norms. Social practices are the predictable behavior patterns that members of a culture typically follow. They have to do with predictable behavior patterns. So how were you taught to eat at the table? Were you meant to have your hands visible at all times? Could you slurp your food? Was it appropriate for you to let out a loud burp after you have eaten? So these social practices tend to be the outward manifestations of beliefs, values, and norms that we all have. So let me give an example of how these work together but are different at the same time. So we could say that education is a value. Now, why is education a value? Well, because there's a belief that if you are educated, you will get better employment opportunities. So why do people go to college? They value education because they believe it will help them be more successful. In the United States, we value stuff, we value money. There's a belief that if you work hard, you can get those things. And so the norm has been to work hard, to have a full-time job, to stay employed during your what we call productive years or whatever that means. And so these work together. Beliefs, values, and norms work together all the time. Being culturally competent, so there's a term you can pick up, helps us recognize cultural differences rather than judging other cultures by our norms. This means not only learning to recognize other cultures, but also the influences in our own. Okay, culture comes from worldview. So understanding a culture's worldview can help you understand its people. And understanding a culture can help you effectively communicate with other people from that culture. And so we want to take a look at some cultural differences and some ways to categorize culture. And then we're going to get into how does that affect our communication and how can we improve it. So I just want to show you a few short clips. These are actually television commercials from HSBC Bank.
Ciao, Sophia.
Sorry.
Niente.
Sorry.
In Italy, different flowers have different meanings. Chrysanthemums, for example, are associated with funerals and sadness.
Sophia è morta.
At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. HSBC, the world's local bank.
唔該晒，
拜拜。
早唞。老婆大人。
你有旺財㗎。
開心啊！今年去地方去。
76% of Americans think that pets are part of the family.
我哋嘅主人房咧，
Interestingly, 72% of New Zealanders won't let their pets sleep with them. Whereas in Hong Kong, 70% of owners said they loved their pets more than humans. Different points of view are welcome here. HSBC, the world's local bank.
People who weren't at our last meeting. Then we'll move on to the department.
Some American management consultants recommend having meetings standing up to save time. Which wouldn't suit this Japanese chairman who likes to take the time to contemplate what is being discussed. It's fine to get some shut-eye in Thailand, but not like this. Showing the soles of your feet is one of the rudest things you can do. And this hand gesture, in parts of Greece, would also be frowned upon. At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge, particularly when it comes to your money, because what we learn in one country can directly benefit our customers in another. HSBC, the world's local bank.
好容易嘅就好簡單啊，就咁做不得。
大家飲杯，飲杯，飲杯，得啦！大家食啊！好嘢啊！好食啊！湯飲埋添。
The English believe it's a slur on your host's food if you don't clear your plate. Whereas the Chinese feel you're questioning their generosity if you do.
買少啲啊！
好，馬上嚟。
At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. Which is why we have local banks staffed by local people in over 80 countries across the globe.
哎呀！伙計，
搞掂啦！
HSBC, the world's local bank.
Okay, I just want to introduce some terms to you so that we just have some common knowledge here. Communication is all about sharing understanding, right? And so we want to share understanding of some key terms. One term that's good to know is co-culture. You guys might not be familiar with this term. You might be more familiar with the term subculture. Now, but the problem with the term subculture is it implies a hierarchy, doesn't it? So it implies that one culture is higher than another because one is sub or less than. And so that brings in a value system that we really don't want to have. So what we want to do is use the term co-culture. And co-cultures have to do with all the cultures that live simultaneously next to each other. So you are actually part of multiple co-cultures. You've got your family culture, you've got the culture of the organization in which you work, you've got the culture of your friends, you've got the culture where you live. There are so many cultures that you're a part of. And then you might be part of a specialized group, like maybe you have a form of autism, maybe you have some sort of disability, maybe your religious culture. All of these are co-cultures, and in fact, you're participating in multiple cultures at one time, even without leaving your home country. And so ethnocentrism is being centered on your own culture, okay? So it's a tendency for one culture to see themselves as better than other cultures. And we find this all over the world, don't we? Certain groups are looked down upon, and other groups look down on other groups. But ethnocentrism is when we think that our ethnicity is better. An analogy that I find really helpful is that of the cultural iceberg. So think about an iceberg. Most of the iceberg is actually under the water, probably 80 to 90%. And so what you can see on top is just the tip of the iceberg, as we say. And so if we use this to examine culture, we can think about the things that are obvious. The things that are obvious about a culture are things like their appearance, their language, their music, their dancing, their food, those kinds of things. But to really understand a culture, we have to get below the waterline. And that's where we get into the why. So if we think about the top of the iceberg being the what, we think about what's below the water, what is not as easily visible, is the why. And that's where we come into beliefs, assumptions, perceptions, attitudes, all those kinds of things that drive what you see on the outside. So you can see that culture has so many depths to it. And to really understand a culture, we have to listen and we have to get past the things that are obvious. So we could ask the question, if you go to a Chinese restaurant and have a meal, have you had a cultural experience? I would argue no, because you've tasted the food, you've seen the obvious things, you've seen the art on the wall and possibly some music and a wait staff that looked Chinese. But did you really learn anything about the culture? No, you didn't learn about their values, their beliefs, their social norms. We're going to talk about warm and cold cultures. Anybody ever heard this term? Now we're going to look at culture from lots of different perspectives. This particular concept is talked about by Sarah Lanier in this book called Foreign to Familiar. She's traveled all over the world. She comes from the southern United States, and so she starts by talking about her own culture and how the southern United States is different than the northern United States. And if you're American, you know that there's some truth to that, right? Where the South would be more of a warm culture and the North would be more of a cold culture. So let's talk about what these mean. Cold cultures tend to be those people that come from Northern Europe, Canada, the US, more in the north than from the south, New Zealand, Australia, and white South Africa. So it's basically those cultures that derive from European backgrounds. So cold cultures can be described in these ways and have these kinds of attributes, tend to be very task-oriented. What do we say that we have in Protestantism for sure? The Protestant work ethic. Cold cultures tend to be quick thinkers and decision makers. Now the thing you got to always keep in mind is there's culture and there's personality. So we have individual personalities and we have generalities in culture. And certainly there are differences. So for example, you might be a highly introverted person where you need a lot of time to process. So you may not be a quick thinker or a quick decision maker, even though you come from a cold culture, because it's your personality to, I need time to think about this. I don't want to be pressed into making a quick decision. So we're always having to sort of balance these two. I just want to say that up front. Cold cultures generally tend to be verbal and direct. So if I want something from you, I would ask you directly. And this can get very interesting. Cold cultures tend to be low context, and low context means that we don't have as much history together, therefore things need to be explained. And cold cultures tend to be very structured and well planned. I lived in Switzerland for 6 years. You can set your watch or your clock by the Swiss trains because they run precisely on time all the time. That is a very structured society, yeah? I've been to other parts of the world where they don't wear watches as much as they have calendars or whatever. Life is way more laid back, right? Cold cultures tend to be very individualistic. Linear. We tend to think in a straight line, kind of like a train runs on the tracks. We have one thought and we're going in a particular direction, and it's very sort of linear and systematic. We are very concerned with facts. Science in itself came out of European roots, a lot of it, and so it was all about discovering what is true or what is factual. So in science you conduct tests, right, to see if something proves to be true time and again. So we're very concerned with facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Sometimes we're more simple-minded in a sense. Transactional. We are more transactional in our thinking, which is the opposite of relational. So transactional is we do a transaction. So if I go to the store, I give them the money, they give me the milk. Okay, that's a transaction. We sign contracts, we have a transactional sort of way of doing life. We have concepts like time is money. That is a concept in many parts of the world, they wouldn't even understand what that means. And I actually have an African friend that has heard me talk about this, and so one day she apologized for tying up my time, and she goes, "Time is money, right?" And I just thought that was so interesting because she was trying to relate to my culture, and she was apologizing for the fact that what we were doing was taking so much time, but she referred back to that. So that time is money thing is a very, very Western, very cold culture context. You can see that we're really talking about Western cultures here. Huh? And we have this idea of get on with business. So because time is money, time is a commodity, time is valuable, that we need to always get on with it. And so, and again, this is one of those things that, depending on your personality, that ties in as well. So warm cultures, we would describe as non-Western. Southern Europe is way more laid back, yeah? And it's interesting that warm cultures tend to come from parts of the world that are warmer. They have warmer climates. Southern Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, although we see some differences in Asia, Mediterranean, Pacific Islanders, and the southern United States. You'll see some generalities that you'll be able to apply, I think, to your culture and things that you've experienced, even if it's just in the United States. So warm cultures tend to be more relational, tend to be more process-oriented. So it's not just reaching the goal, it's how do we get there? So how do we go through the process of getting to our decision, not just making the actual decision? Tend to be indirect communicators. After many years of interacting with many cultures, I'm still learning what this is. But say, for example, indirect communication. You wouldn't actually ask directly. You would go and sort of beat around the bush. So, for example, I was in Latin America dealing with a Korean family, a lot of Koreans in different parts of Latin America. And I was in this Korean lady's house, and I complimented something. Well, she gave it to me. I didn't actually want it. Now, there's probably different things involved in that. One could be that there's an obligation if someone is a guest and they like something that you have to give it to them, or did she think I was indirectly asking for it? She gave it to me. I didn't even want the thing. But, you know, there's always these different things in play. High context. Okay, now you see on this image, we have two coffee cups, right? So in a high context culture, they tend to be a culture that has way more history. So everything is understood. So you can have just a coffee cup that's a coffee cup. But in a low context culture, you got to have all this writing. You got to have all this writing that says, caution, this beverage is hot. We have to say things with a lot more words. So for example, in the African American culture, it's much more high context, much more warm, much more communal, much more relationship than the predominant white culture in North America. So in an African American culture, there's a lot of things that are just understood, and they communicate with a lot of nonverbals. Plus, everybody knows. You just know certain things because you have this shared common history. So if I, as a white person, come into an African American culture or another high context culture, I could be the only one in the room who doesn't know what's going on. Everybody else does, because they just sort of know. Now, whenever you're with a group that's been together a long time and you have a lot of history, then you have more context. So you have things like inside jokes, right? And you have more common understanding. And just the slightest little facial movement or something can communicate volumes, whereas you can imagine an outsider coming in who doesn't have that context is clueless. So this can be very interesting. And I feel this at times when I go into a high context culture where everybody else knows what's going on and I don't. Now we have some people that work here that are from India, very high context culture. So there's a lot of things that don't have to be said because everybody already knows them. In warm cultures, there's an emphasis on the moment. I like to tell this story about my dear friend Malouk. Malouk is from West Africa. And I have spent a lot of time with Malouk. I went to Burkina Faso where he met up with me one time to go to a film festival, the FESPACO West African Film Festival, because I was working on my doctoral studies. I was studying African film. So all these movies are playing over several days, and I'm on a mission, right? Plus I'm getting college credit for this. So it's like, I got to get to as many films as I can. So I'm being real super task oriented, right? I'm being real sort of, And I'm being a direct communicator, which I know I offend my dear African brothers and sisters all the time. And I'm working on it, but anyway, the more I study this, hopefully the better I'm getting. In Africa, you don't just go from point A to point B. Because if you happen to pass within a few blocks of a family member, you got to go visit the family, right? So you take this little detour, right? Oh, we got to stop and visit. So we stop at the relative's house, and of course we sit down, and then they send the kids to go get cold drinks down at the local kiosk. And so we're sitting there, and time's marching on, and I'm getting more panicked because I want to get to the movie, right? So my blood pressure's going up, and but poor Malouk, he's from a relational culture, and there's an emphasis on the moment. So you're not as concerned about what you were going to do because here you are right now. Let's enjoy the time. Now, poor Malouk got put in the middle because he was in his culture, and yet he was hosting me, and he knew I had an agenda, and so I'm sitting there, you know, getting steam, and I'm like, okay, Malouk, we gotta go, and he's like, you know, poor guy was in the middle. And in Africa, you know, parts of Africa, you even have to ask. You say, I ask for the road. You don't just say, okay, I got to go now, goodbye. You actually have to go through this whole process of getting there. So it was a cultural difference, right? I don't remember if we got to the movie or not. But anyway, I remember the situation, and to me that was a real example of the difference between living in the moment and really being task-oriented. So that was a real cultural difference. And we've talked about it since then, and he's given me permission to tell the story. In warm cultures, time is not a commodity. And I think in a lot of cultures where they don't have as much control over things, you kind of have to take things as they come, don't you? Because if you go and turn on the tap and no water comes out, you just deal with it. Or if you go and flip on the light switch and there's no electricity, you deal with it. And so this getting frustrated because things aren't going the way you want to can be a very much a sign of living in the West, because we're kind of spoiled, aren't we? But in other parts of the world, it's not that. Time is not a commodity. Time is on a different continuum than actual money and other things. And in warm cultures, you need less context because there's so much that's already understood. Warm cultures tend to be much more collective in their thinking. They tend to be much more group-oriented. So what is important for the group is much more important than what is important for the individual. They tend to avoid risks as much. In the West, we sort of champion risk-taking. Entrepreneurs, that kind of thing, taking risk. We take risk with our money in the stock market. We take risk by starting a business. We just take all kinds of risks. Whereas in warm cultures, there's much more of a hesitation to do that. And part of that is, in many warm cultures, not all of them, but in many warm cultures, the person who excels among their group actually gets punished. So in places like East Africa, the blade of grass that rises above the other actually gets whacked off, because there's such a value placed on blending in and being like everybody else that you don't actually want to stand out. Circular. They tend to be much more circular in their thinking and circular in the way they do life. So when we were going from the hotel to the movie, it's not a straight line. It's, oh, we go visit the relatives. And that's also the way they think. Some of you may have heard a brilliant Indian philosopher and author named Vishal Mangalwadi. He's very, very circular in the way he speaks. So when he's talking, he's not just making a beeline for his point. He talks about this, and he goes and he gives a lot of detail. And then he goes around to the next thing, and he goes around and he talks a lot about that. And he keeps going around. And if you're a Westerner, where you're used to sort of a linear way of thinking, you can get lost. I was actually with him a few months ago, and I could see the crowd doing this. And so I said something to the leaders. I'm like, you might want to explain how if you're a Westerner and you're sort of starting to tune out, that there's a different communication style going on. Circular communication can start losing linear thinkers. And so I've been in situations where he would lose me. And then he would give his point, and it'd be like a knife, and I'd go, oh my gosh, that's brilliant, I love that. But getting there was difficult. So just like you can imagine somebody who's used to a circular sort of mentality and way of communicating where they're used to sort of pondering each of the little micro points. If you just like barrel through in a direct fashion, that could be freaking them out too, right? So all of this affects our communication. Warm cultures tend to be much more processing oriented. I have to share an example. I was in Colombia. It was a meeting of communicators from different parts of Latin America. And so we had somebody from Argentina who was leading the meeting. She would sort of throw out a point, and then suddenly there'd be these little conversations going on around the room. In my Western linear culture, one person speaks at a time, and there's an order to how you do a meeting, and you have an agenda, and it's all about sort of making decisions and so forth. And what I saw happening there just made me crazy because it was like milk bubbling, where all these little conversations started up. And it seemed like everybody in the room was talking at the same time. And I thought, this meeting's a disaster. She has no control over this meeting, blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, my blood pressure's going up because I'm still learning about culture. And this is, I think, why I study it, because I need to understand it so much. It doesn't come naturally. After the meeting, I said to Veronica, I said, that was a disaster, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, no, that's how we do business. That's how we do it in Latin America. And so, you go into a situation, you have to sort of understand that. Warm cultures are less likely to volunteer an opinion. Because a lot of warm cultures tend to be also authoritarian cultures, there's an order to who gets to talk and who doesn't talk. Now, in that meeting, that's one example of where it was sort of bubbling up where everybody was talking. But like in a classroom, say, for example, you're teaching an educational opportunity. You got a bunch of Africans or people from warm cultures in your class, and you throw out questions, they may not respond to you. There may be complete silence because for them to even ask a question would be taken as questioning your authority. When I went to East Africa is when I first started cluing into this, that nobody was going to volunteer anything and nobody was going to ask a question unless I actually drew them out. And so it's a real challenge in that kind of situation to say, okay, Lori, what do you think about that? And then be comfortable with the silence to give them time to think and then solicit the response. One of the ways that we've found helpful is to come into a situation like a seminar, to have an invitational introduction instead of me standing up and saying, my name is so-and-so, blah, 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 and then we go around the room. That kind of is one style, but what's more effective in a warm culture is, okay, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and then when you're finished, you invite someone else. And so we go around the room that way by this invitational process, and it actually kind of flattens the room so that I'm not the teacher telling you what to do, and I'm not the teacher sort of setting the model, but that we're creating this level playing field, especially in cultures where there's a high distance between who's on top and who's on the bottom. You see what I mean? A lot of cultures need to be invited. Latin America is another one where we could go down and we could have meetings and we could be completely unproductive because we've never heard from the locals, but not realizing we have to draw them out. And that's a problem we have sometimes in nonprofit organizations where we have these meetings that are Westerners and non-Westerners, and all the Westerners do all the talking, and nobody calls on the non-Westerners, and so we never hear from them. And how much we lose because we haven't had that opportunity. And warm cultures tend to be much more complex in their thinking, and I can't even describe that for you, but I just know that there's a whole lot more going on multiple levels, and it's important to get to know each other. So again, relationship-oriented, less transactional, much more relational.